There is a kind of silence that settles over a man when the world believes he has already been erased. Stone walls, cold air, a body weakened by hunger and neglect. Somewhere deep in the mountains of France, far from the heat of the Caribbean sun, an older black man sits alone in a prison cell. He has no army now, no uniform, no titles spoken in fear or respect. Only his breath, growing thinner with each passing day. The men who locked him here believe this is the end of the story. They believe that by removing the man, they have removed the danger, that by freezing his body, they have frozen the idea he carried. They do not hear what echoes beyond these walls. They do not understand what kind of roots they are dealing with. Before his strength failed him, this man spoke words that would outlive his captors. He said that by cutting him down, they had only cut the trunk of the tree of liberty. The roots, he warned, were many, and they ran deep. This is not a story about a perfect hero. It is not a story about easy victories or clean choices. It is the story of a man born with no legal name, no recorded birthday, and no recognized worth, who nonetheless stood up against the most powerful empires of his time and forced them to listen. Long before he became a general, before armies marched at his command, before his name frightened governors and emperors, he was simply a man learning how to stand without permission. A man who understood, early in life, that chains are not only made of iron, they are made of laws, of lies, of quiet expectations that tell you to accept your place and be grateful for survival. He did not accept it. What makes this story endure is not only what he achieved, but what it cost him. Power did not bring him peace. Leadership did not bring him rest. Every step forward pulled him further away from safety, further away from the people he was trying to protect, and closer to a fate he could sense but could not avoid. For those who come from a people whose histories were interrupted, renamed, or deliberately forgotten, his life speaks in a familiar tone. It asks questions that do not fade with time. What does it mean to be free when the world is built to profit from your silence? How much of yourself can you give to protect the future before there is nothing left to save you? Tonight, this story is being told not to judge him, but to remember him, not as a statue and not as a slogan, but as a human being who chose to stand upright in a world that demanded he kneel. This is the story of Toussaint Louverture, and it begins long before the prison walls closed in around him. He was born into a world that did not bother to record his arrival. No official date, no certificate, no acknowledgement that a human life had begun. On the plantation in Saint-Domingue, births like his were noted, if at all, the way one counted livestock. A number added, a body accounted for, nothing more. They called him Toussaint Breda, not because it was his name, but because it was the name of the land that claimed him. Like so many others, his identity was tied to soil he did not own and labor he did not choose. From the beginning, the system told him exactly who he was supposed to be. And yet, beneath that imposed name, something older survived. His father, Hippolyte, had been born in Africa, long before chains, long before ships, long before sugar fields. He belonged to the Alada people of what is now Benin. Some said he had been of noble blood, possibly connected to a royal line. European records could not confirm it, and history, written by enslavers, was quick to doubt it. But among the enslaved, Hippolyte carried himself with a quiet authority that did not need documents to exist. Respect followed him. That mattered more than titles ever could. Toussaint grew up watching this man who had lost everything that could be taken, yet somehow retained something that could not. He learned, without formal lessons, that dignity does not come from permission. It comes from memory, from knowing that before bondage, there was belonging. The plantation tried to erase that memory. It taught obedience. It rewarded silence. It punished those who remembered too much. But memory has a way of hiding in plain sight. It lived in language, in posture, in the way elders spoke to children when overseers were not listening. As a boy, Toussaint was small and sickly. Other children mocked him, calling him a thin stick, a body that looked easy to break. The world around him agreed. Everything about plantation life was designed to grind down the weak first. But weakness has a strange way of sharpening the mind. Unable to rely on brute strength, he learned patience. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed how power moved through the plantation, who carried it openly and who carried it quietly. He saw how fear ruled loudly, but respect ruled longer. Unlike most field slaves, Toussaint was assigned domestic work. He cared for animals. He handled horses. He moved between spaces where different kinds of people spoke freely, forgetting that someone like him might be listening. In those moments, he absorbed more than orders. He absorbed knowledge. Language came to him early. He spoke the tongue of his parents and the Creole of the island. Later, he learned to read and write French, a skill so rare among the enslaved that it marked him as dangerous, without him ever raising a hand. Still, he did not rush toward rebellion. Roots grow before trees break the ground. By the time Toussaint reached adulthood, he understood something many never get the chance to learn. The system that enslaved him was strong, but it was not permanent. It depended on obedience, on forgetting, on convincing people that their beginning had no meaning. He remembered, and that memory would become the foundation of everything that followed. There are moments in a life when the world reveals its rules without apology. For Toussaint, one of those moments came not on a battlefield, but on a quiet walk home from church. He was carrying a prayer book, a small object, unremarkable to anyone who believed knowledge was their birthright. To the man who stopped him, it was an offense. A white man struck him and told him that a black man had no business reading. The blow itself mattered less than the message behind it. It was not simply violence. It was a reminder, a warning. The world was saying, know your place. Do not reach beyond what we allow. Toussaint did not fight back. He did not shout. He walked away with the knowledge that some lines were enforced, not by law alone, but by fear. He never forgot that lesson. From then on, learning became more than curiosity. It became resistance. Reading was no longer just a skill. It was a quiet refusal to disappear. Each word he absorbed strengthened something inside him that could not be whipped out of existence. As a young man, his body still carried the marks of early weakness. He was not the strongest in the fields. He was not built for brute force, but discipline began to replace fragility. He rode horses with ease. He swam well. He trained his body carefully, not to dominate others, but to master himself. Self-control became his armor. He also learned to measure his words. Where others spoke in anger, he listened. Where others rushed, he waited. Plantation life rewarded impulsive cruelty from overseers, but it punished impulsive resistance from the enslaved. Toussaint studied this imbalance closely. He learned that survival required patience, and transformation required timing. Faith shaped him as much as experience. Catholic teachings, absorbed through the Jesuit influence on the island, reinforced his belief in order, restraint, and moral responsibility. He did not confuse faith with submission. Instead, he used it to anchor himself. It gave him a language for justice and a framework for endurance. There were teachers in his life, some formal, some accidental, a godfather who could read, older men who remembered Africa, freed people who showed him what life beyond bondage could look like. Each encounter added another layer to his understanding of the world. By the time Toussaint reached maturity, he was no longer merely surviving. He was preparing, though he may not have known for what yet. His mind was trained. His temper was controlled. His sense of right and wrong was deeply rooted. This was not the making of a rebel driven by rage. It was the making of a leader shaped by restraint, reflection, and an unshakable belief that a man's worth did not depend on permission from power. Among the enslaved, there were men who commanded through fear, and there were men who commanded through force. Toussaint was neither. Long before he led soldiers, people came to him for a different reason. They came because he knew how to heal. On the Breda plantation and beyond, sickness was constant. Bodies were worked past exhaustion. Wounds went untreated. Fever spread easily, and death arrived without ceremony. Doctors served plantation owners, not the people whose labor sustained them. In that absence, knowledge became survival. Toussaint carried knowledge that had crossed the ocean with his father. The use of herbs, the understanding of the body's rhythms, the patience required to listen before acting. Over time, he combined what he inherited with what he observed from European practices. He learned what eased pain. He learned what restored strength. He learned when nothing could be done, and when hope itself mattered. This gave him a kind of authority that could not be appointed. When a man heals you, you trust him. When he asks nothing in return, you remember him. When he treats your suffering as real in a world that denies it, you follow him. That trust spread quietly. Toussaint did not announce himself. He did not demand loyalty. His reputation moved ahead of him, carried by word of mouth, by gratitude, by lives extended long enough to matter. People spoke of him with respect, not fear. Healing taught him more than medicine. It taught him how to read people. Pain reveals truth. Fear exposes weakness. Hope changes behavior. By observing bodies, he learned to observe minds. This skill would later make him dangerous in ways his enemies never fully understood. When rebellion finally came, Toussaint entered it not as a brute, but as a stabilizing force. He discouraged unnecessary cruelty. He restrained impulses that would have burned everything too quickly. Others fought with rage. He fought with purpose, because he understood something essential. A movement built only on anger destroys itself. A movement rooted in trust can endure. Those who followed him believed he would not waste their lives. They believed he saw them not as expendable bodies, but as human beings whose survival mattered. That belief held armies together when hunger, exhaustion, and fear threatened to tear them apart. Even his enemies noticed the difference. Prisoners under his authority were more likely to survive. Negotiations, when possible, replaced slaughter. Discipline replaced chaos. Order replaced vengeance. This did not make him weak. It made him effective. The man who knew how to stop bleeding also knew how to hold a line. The man who listened to pain knew when silence was necessary. His authority came not from shouting commands, but from the certainty that when he spoke, it was worth hearing. This was the foundation of his leadership. Before flags, before ranks, before titles, there was trust, and trust, once earned, is stronger than fear. When the world finally caught fire, it did not ask Toussaint if he was ready. The uprising began as explosions of rage scattered across the northern plains of Saint-Domingue. Plantations burned, masters were killed, long-contained fury poured out without structure, without mercy, without a clear vision of what would come next. For many, it was enough simply to destroy what had destroyed them. Toussaint watched carefully. He understood the anger. He carried it too. But he also saw the danger. Fire can cleanse, but it can also consume everything, including the people who light it. A revolt driven only by vengeance would invite annihilation. Empires were patient. They could afford to wait for chaos to exhaust itself. So Toussaint chose a different path. When he stepped into the revolution, he did not come as a screaming avenger. He came as an organizer. He brought discipline where there was frenzy, direction where there was confusion, purpose where there was only release. He insisted that freedom required more than courage. It required restraint. Men noticed the difference immediately. Under his influence, fighters began to move with intention. Orders replaced impulses. Supply lines were protected. Civilians were spared when possible. Prisoners were not slaughtered out of habit. This was not softness. It was strategy, grounded in moral clarity. Toussaint believed that if the enslaved were to claim freedom, they had to prove something to the world and to themselves. They had to show that they could build, not only destroy, that they could govern their own rage as firmly as they governed their enemies. Alliances shifted around him. Empires competed for control. Flags changed hands. Toussaint navigated these storms without worshipping any banner. He gave loyalty only to one idea, that no black man should ever again be forced into chains. When one power promised protection, he accepted it. When that promise revealed itself as hollow, he walked away. To outsiders, this looked like betrayal. To Toussaint, it was survival with integrity. He was not fighting for crowns or capitals. He was fighting for a future where his people could breathe without permission. His reputation grew quickly. Soldiers followed him because he led from the front. He rode with them. He endured the same hunger. He faced the same bullets. But he also demanded discipline. Looting was punished. Reckless killing was restrained. He was shaping an army that could outlast fear. Victories followed, not because he was the most brutal, but because he was the most prepared. He understood terrain. He understood timing. He understood that endurance often mattered more than spectacle. In the chaos of revolution, Toussaint became something rare. A man who could harness fury without being consumed by it. A leader who could turn rebellion into a cause. The world had ignited, and Toussaint Louverture had stepped fully into the light. Freedom, once claimed, brought a question Toussaint could not avoid. How does our people eat when the war is over? The plantations that once fed the wealth of empires now lay in ruins. Fields were burned. Mills were silent. Ports were damaged. The same system that had brutalized the enslaved had also structured the entire economy of the island. Destroying it had been necessary. Replacing it was unavoidable. Toussaint understood the danger immediately. Hunger would do what armies could not. Starvation would invite foreign powers back under the pretense of order. Chaos would justify change returning under a different name. So he made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He ordered the land back into production. Formerly enslaved men and women were told they must work the fields again. This time they were paid. This time the whip was forbidden. This time they were legally free. But to many, the difference felt thin. They had fought for freedom, bled for it, buried family for it. And now they were being told where to work, when to work, and how to live. Resentment grew quietly. Toussaint believed discipline was the price of survival. He believed that proving black self-governance meant proving stability, productivity, and order. If the island collapsed economically, he believed freedom itself would be blamed, and slavery would return, wearing the mask of necessity. But the people felt something else. They felt that their sacrifices were being managed instead of honored, that their suffering was being organized rather than healed, that the man who had once stood beside them now stood above them. Toussaint was not blind to this. He heard the complaints. He saw the tension, yet he pressed forward. To him, leadership meant choosing the future over comfort, even when it cost him love. This is where the distance began. The closer Toussaint moved toward building a state, the further he moved from the hearts of the laborers. Authority replaced intimacy. Decrees replaced conversations. Soldiers were now used not only to defend freedom, but to enforce order. He told himself this was temporary, that once stability was secured, life would soften. But power has a way of hardening its own logic. Each concession to control made the next easier. The man who had once healed bodies now managed systems. History would later argue over this moment. Some would say he betrayed the people. Others would say he saved them from something worse. What cannot be denied is the weight of the choice he carried. Toussaint was no longer only fighting empires. He was fighting time, hunger, expectation, and the impossible task of turning revolution into a functioning nation. And in that struggle, the loneliness of leadership began to take its final shape. By the time Toussaint reached the height of his power, the battlefield had changed. The enemies were no longer only across the field with rifles and flags. They were closer now, inside the government, inside the movement, inside the trust that once bound people to him. Every great decision sharpened the moral edge he walked upon. He had spared white prisoners when others demanded blood. He believed a new world could not be built on endless revenge. Mercy, he believed, was not weakness. It was proof that black freedom did not need to imitate white cruelty. Many understood this. Many did not. To those who had suffered the worst abuses, mercy felt like betrayal. Forgiveness felt like forgetting. Toussaint accepted their anger as the cost of the path he chose. He believed history would judge restraint more kindly than rage. Then came the choice that broke something he could not repair. Moise, his adopted nephew, spoke for the laborers. He carried their frustration, their exhaustion, their sense that freedom had been postponed rather than fulfilled. When unrest turned into rebellion, Toussaint faced a decision no leader ever wants to make. If he allowed defiance, the fragile state would fracture. If he crushed it, he would crush his own blood. He chose order. Moise was executed. The message was unmistakable. The revolution would not devour itself. But in preventing that fate, Toussaint lost something far more difficult to regain: the unquestioned trust of the people. From that moment on, he ruled more than he led. Across the ocean, another man was watching closely. Napoleon Bonaparte had little patience for nuance. He saw a former slave commanding armies, managing trade, writing constitutions. He saw not a partner, but a threat. Toussaint believed reason could still prevail. He believed loyalty, order, and productivity would earn respect. Instead, they earned suspicion. Letters arrived, polite and reassuring. Promises were made. Authority was affirmed. Toussaint recognized the danger, but underestimated its speed. He thought time was on his side. It was not. When the French expedition arrived, it came wrapped in assurances of peace. Toussaint was tired of war, tired of blood, tired of watching his people suffer. He chose negotiation over annihilation. That choice sealed his fate. Invited to talks, he walked into a trap with dignity, intact, and weapons lowered. Arrested without honor, removed quietly, taken away before the island could respond. The man who had outmaneuvered empires was undone, not by force, but by faith in promises never meant to be kept. This was the final irony of his life. He had mastered war, he had mastered governance, but he could not master an empire's refusal to accept a black man standing in command. When Toussaint was taken from the island, the world assumed the story was over. They shipped him across the ocean in chains, separating him from his family, his land, and everything he had built. He was placed in a stone prison, far from warmth, far from allies, far from any chance of return. In that cold cell, stripped of authority and comfort, he was reduced to what his enemies believed. He had always been a single black man, isolated and contained. They were wrong. In captivity, Toussaint no longer commanded armies or signed decrees, but he did something just as dangerous. He remembered, he wrote, he explained his choices, not to beg for mercy, but to preserve truth. He worried not about his legacy, but about the fate of his people and his children. Even in confinement, his thoughts were never small. The prison weakened his body. Cold and neglect did what battles could not. He died there, quietly, far from the land he had fought to free. There were no drums, no final speech, no ceremony, just silence. But history did not obey his jailers. Back in Saint-Domingue, the warning Toussaint had spoken proved true. The trunk had been cut down, but the roots were alive. The people he had trained, the discipline he had instilled, and the idea he had made impossible to ignore, survived him. The struggle continued. Foreign armies weakened. Disease spread. Resistance hardened. Freedom, delayed, did not die. Haiti would rise as the first black republic in the modern world, an event that terrified slaveholding societies everywhere. Toussaint did not live to see it, but without him, it would not have been possible. Today, his story does not belong only to Haiti. It belongs to everyone whose history was interrupted, whose dignity was denied, whose ancestors were told they were less than human. His life reminds us that freedom is rarely clean, leadership is rarely thanked, and progress often demands sacrifices the world does not reward. In the quiet hours, when people seek history, legends not for spectacle, but for meaning, Toussaint's journey still speaks. For those who turn to history for sleep, his life offers not comfort, but grounding within African history and the hard truths of historical facts. His name stands as proof that black history is not a footnote, but a foundation. He was not perfect. He was not gentle with himself or others. But he stood when standing was forbidden. He chose dignity when submission promised safety. And though his body failed in a cold prison, the idea he carried never did. As long as these stories are told, as long as they are remembered and passed on, Toussaint Louverture is not gone. He is standing still,